I always like to begin by saying that, remember, in these talks, each talk is complete. If you haven't been to any of the previous ones, it doesn't make any difference. Because I knew that I wouldn't always have the same people. And if I refer to anything from a past lecture, I'll just give a brief explanation of it, so that everybody will be on the same goal. Okay, and the second thing I pointed out, because I do a good bit of the history of how the Mass developed. I am not doing that so that you will leave and say, boy, that was an interesting thing. Well, I hope you are, but I hope you're primarily saying, I try to pick out the things that are really pastoral and that may still influence the way we look to the future in terms of the evolution of the Mass. And I would suggest, especially tonight, because remember my general topic tonight is Second Vatican Council and the evolution of the Mass. How that has created a new environment, a new way of looking at the development of many things in the church, okay? And sometimes I think when I talk about this, it's good to try to envision what do you think, what did the Mass look like? Sort of, how was it to, because we're so used to it in a certain way, it used to be the altar rail and so on. And I always like to share this story about how it looks sometimes to people who have never been to a Mass or a different religion. And this is a true story. My first assignment was at Our Lady of Grace Parish in Scott Township, Mount Lebanon. Okay. Block up the street from us was a Reformed Lutheran church. Now, if you know anything at all about the divisions of the Lutheran church, the Reformed Lutherans are very traditional. I got to know the pastor once. I said, what are your worship services like? He said, our worship services are the Word of God and preaching. And that's it. No external symbols, no candles, nothing except that. Well, here's the story. After I had been there about 2.5, 3 years, and I knew the congregation there just a little bit, I got a phone call from a study group from the Reformed Lutheran Church. And the gentleman was very polite. And, being so different from us, he was very careful too in what he said. He said, Father Lauer, I know you're the associate pastor at Our Lady of Grace, and we thought maybe you could help us. We choose a new topic every 6 months, and we like to get deeply into it, especially things we know nothing about. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. Hope I can help you. What's your topic you've chosen? And remember, this is back in the 60s. He said, our topic is the Catholic Latin High Mass. Some of you are old enough to remember what the High Mass was like on Sunday. That's when you had the main choir and the singing and extra altar boys and candles and everything. I said, oh. I was really surprised. And then he said so carefully, he said, now I know it would not be appropriate for us to ask to come and worship with you, but would it be disrespectful if we came just as observers? I said, not at all. As a matter of fact, I'll have one of our Catholic study groups sit with you so they can kind of comment on the way and let you know what's going on. So they said, wonderful. And we set it up for about a month from then. Well, that Sunday came. And my pastor then, Father Conroy later, Monsignor Conroy, had the Mass. Now, he was a man way ahead of his time. He was not scholarly, but pastorally. And you know how we always didn't face the people and so on? Well, whenever he came out for the High Mass, some of you remember, we always began with, we used the Latin term then, the asperges, the sprinkling, okay? Every High Mass, okay? The way it was done very often was, the priest would come out dressed in, a cope instead of the vestment chasuble right away, and with his back to the people, and then he would turn around, intone the asperges, sprinkle 3 times, bow, and had his back to the people for the rest of the Mass. Now, never Father Conroy. He came out, and some people sometimes were surprised at this. He looked at the congregation, he faced them, intoned the asperges, and he always had an Irish smile on his face. but I always said looked like the cat that swallowed the mouse, that he knew something you didn't know. And with his big smile, he sprinkled every aisle. Absolutely wonderfully, with great vigor. Now, it was a large parish. We had almost 2,000 families. But midway down, he recognized that those 6 or 7 people were new, and so he welcomed them. And he said, welcome, nice to have you with us. And to make them feel very at home, he sprinkled them thoroughly with the aspergillus. And of course, they're wondering what's going on. Okay? Now, honest to goodness, he gets down a little bit further in his sprinkling, big smile and everything. And the aspergillus slips out of his hand and flies across like a boomerang across the congregation. Everything was expressive like this, waiting for it to go through a window or hit somebody. And honest to goodness, I remember the usher's name, George Quiter. George took 2 steps in the back, caught it with one hand, piously went over to Father, bowed, handed him the aspergillus, and went sprinkling up the other aisle. It was wonderful. What a sight. Well, I hadn't met the group, so I was standing in the back of the church. And of course, then we didn't greet people, that was before that. We did it at Our Lady of Grace. Conway was ahead in everything. Well, they were like the last people coming out, having an enthusiastic conversation with their Catholic counterparts. And this one guy who was real, like an extrovert, I heard him say before he got down, he said, boy, that was a dynamite service. Do you do that every Sunday? And he meant it. He had never seen. He saw all these candles, all this sprinkling, incense going up in the air. Throwing the aspergillus could have been part of the service. So it is interesting to me, what did it look like? Now, I'm going to tell you this evening, especially about the Second Vatican Council and that document on the liturgy. Exceptional in many, many ways. Now, what I'd like to tell you as background first is kind of the Vatican Council comes, as you know, 1962 to 65. But after the Reformation, I got to tell you something about the Reformation last time. Certain things were in place that did not change from the 16th century till 1962. Exactly the same. Now, some of them were this. I mentioned this last time, to those of you who weren't there. The Missal of Pius V in 1570, to correct some of the faults that the Protestants pointed out, gave us an absolute type for the Mass in Latin that Catholics all over the world had to use. Same words. The Missal of Pius V lasted until 1962 with almost no change. Amazing. In the Latin, That never happened before in our tradition. Also, they mandated the priest was allowed to say only one Mass on Sunday, the Council of Trent, which addressed the Reformation. And one of the reasons was that one of the great faults of the tradition was some priests would say Mass 8 or 9 times to get 8 or 9 stipends in one day, a private Mass. So they were allowed to do it only once, and the Council of Trent said that you cannot say the Mass purely by yourself. There's got to be at least one person who is there. So there's a congregation. But when I went to Rome, and we had private Masses in the building we lived in, and there were about 12, 14 altars. Well, to have a server, we had 3 or 4 lay employees, like the receptionist in front and so on. Well, they would come in, and the 4 of them would serve all the Masses. And the way they did it is they'd go from altar to altar. And if they needed the bell rung at this one, they'd do that. Go over in response to one of the prayers over here and so on. So there was at least one person present for each one. Remarkable. The Sacred Congregation of Rites was established in that same time period in response to a lot of things that the Protestants pointed out that were flaws and faults, okay? And that gave us consistency and an exact canon law about how the Mass was to be done. Many of those laws, all the way up to 1962. Okay? Also, they mandated that each diocese should have a liturgical commission. And of course, we continue that in certain ways today. Okay? And it is amazing in one way to me that Mass could remain almost untouched by any change. Now, I think I mentioned this last time, but I'll mention it again to anybody who's new. The first real change took place in 1961 by Pope John the 23rd, year before the council. And I know I said this to you. I'll see if you remember this. And what he did was he added one word to what we call the canon of the Mass. Canon meaning sort of rule. The Great Thanksgiving Prayer. One word. Does anybody remember what the word was?
Joseph.
Very good. The name of Joseph, among all those other names, you know. And people thought, well, oh, that's charming, and so on. Not at all, the scriptures, the liturgical scholars say. Why did he do that? To show that this is the way it was going to be. In the Vatican Council, a lot of things might change. And it was his way of doing a little symbol, okay, to show the direction that we might be going in. There's that second thing that I'd like to point out is how there were some other things that were established in the church that we were used to up until the council that happened before. For example, do you know we always did communion in the hand right from the beginning? Of course, remember the house churches during the first 300 years is where people went to Mass because of the persecutions. Naturally, they did communion in the hand, okay, and drank from the cup and so on. When we got a very, very strong focus, especially in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, on the sinfulness of everyone, that were born sinners and so on, that many strict bishops and so on said, we shouldn't be touching the body of Christ with our hand. And from 878, roughly, at a small council, the Council of Rouen in France, but somehow they caught on everywhere. From then on, you had to receive communion in the tongue. And that led to a very interesting change. The baking of hosts, because it was much more difficult to put a piece of bread on somebody's tongue. And then in the 12th century, another interesting change. More and more people had joined the faith, and of course communion had great numbers of people. So they said in the 12th century, first it just was custom, and then it was mandated, that you gave people only the host, the body of Christ. And that lasted till 1962. Okay. So things like that got to be part of the way we did things. Okay. Really surprising. Then finally, in the, well, probably 10th, 11th, 12th century, when finally the challenge of Islam was sort of with the church, the Catholic Church and the Muslim community, was kind of settled. Greek philosophy took over almost completely our theology and the way we explained things. And Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, Philip Hughes says in his book, now, it might be an exaggeration, he said, after this time period, suddenly it began to be rumored in the Catholic Church that long before Jesus was heard of, a man named Aristotle had solved all the problems of the human condition. His philosophy really is remarkable, brilliant, but it's very exact, very speculative. And so what that philosophy did was try to explain almost everything in our tradition. And we got terms like, you know the terms, transubstantiation, consubstantial, matter and form for the sacraments, and things like, now they didn't give us quite the definition that all of you memorized, I am sure, when you were in grade school. Would you do that together once? What definition did you memorize? A sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. I have done that almost in every state of the Union, and everybody still knows that definition. Now, here is the philosophical problem with it. And I'll use this just as an example. In any good definition, and all the philologists will tell you this, the word that comes after is the heart of what you're defining. Is a sacrament, in its utter essence, an outward sign? Not at all. Now, I won't ask you to do this now unless you want to. What should come after the is? Grace. Okay, grace is a little bit of an effect. That would be one of the effects. Pardon me?
Participation, sharing.
Carry that out a little bit.
Miracle.
A miracle? Almost, but you're going in the right direction now. Okay, well, I'll just say it very simple. What is a sacrament? It is essentially a special meeting with Christ. We meet Christ in many ways, but this is special because Christ invites us. I'll see you in the bread. I'll meet you in the water. Now, we have never established another definition, but if we did, something like that would have to come after the copulative verb. A sacrament is a special meeting with Christ. And Christ initiated it, not I. Okay? Well, the philosophy that we got from the 12th, 13th century stayed with us almost through that whole period, and with us in Mass liturgy until, first, the liturgical movement. You probably all remember that term. The liturgical movement was going on in the Western Church, okay, maybe 50 years before the Council, and was very influential on it. And it was moving in a different direction. Okay? And I'll say more about that as we proceed through this talk. Okay? Okay, the second portion of my talk, an introduction to Vatican II. One of the most remarkable things, I think, and two scholars who wrote a book on the history of Vatican II think, that the way the council was called is unique. Now, some of you may remember this. Pius XII reigned for about 23 years or so. When he passed away and the next gathering came to elect a pope, what happened was there were two candidates. One of them a little more progressive, the other a little bit more traditional. But the cardinals couldn't seem to budge. Neither of them got enough votes. And, they do sometimes 2 or 3 ballots a day, and it just wasn't working. So finally, a group of cardinals got together. At least this is in this book, The History of the Council of Vatican II. And they said, let's just elect a compromise candidate for a while. And let's get a holy person that nobody will object to. And let's get somebody who really is very thoughtful, etc. Doesn't have to be a scholar, etc. So, and elect him. But he said, after the long, long term of Pius XII, let's get somebody who is very old. they selected the oldest candidate up till then in the history of papal elections. He's about 76, almost 77. By the way, only one person after that was older. Ratzinger. He was almost 79. But anyhow, they had their ideal candidate, and they said, okay, while he's in, we can sort of be fashioning what should happen next. Now, here is what I think is the amazing thing that some scholars have pointed out. They said, isn't it incredible, 88 days after he was elected Pope, he personally called for a council. Not a committee, not deep consultation, but 88 days later, in a meeting with several cardinals and other priests and so on, a group during a Christian Unity Week at the Church of St. Mary Major in Rome, he announced to them, we are going to hold a council. He did not ask them, should we hold a council? He said, we are going to. Now, I'd like your response. How do you think we should do this? What would be most helpful? They were stunned. According to one scholar who seemed to know a lot about this when I was in Rome, he said, out of all the people there, the cardinals and so on, only 5 responded with very banal responses. Nobody was enthusiastic about it. And some people were absolutely opposed to it. And the name I'll give you is Cardinal Ottaviani. Okay. He was dead set against it. Well, it gave him, the Pope, some problem, but he just kept going through it, Now, I learned from sources close to the Vatican. Remember, you hear that quite often? Certain insights into this. Now, those sources close to the Vatican, and I really became convinced that they were among the great sources, were those men who had kiosks around St. Peter's selling papers and magazines. They seemed to know so much about what was going on. And this one guy I got to know pretty well. Now, I don't know that what he was telling me most of the time was true, but it certainly indicated a certain tone that was in, in the consciousness of people. And he said about that, I was talking about that, and he said, oh, no, I said, because John was loved. And I said, well, and I was saying to him in Italian, and I was saying, il Papa è, the Pope is, etc. And he said, no, Padre, not il Papa. But, this is in Italian, but he said, Papa. He is our daddy. Very touching to me. Beloved, still loved. And by the way, he died after the first session of the council. Okay, still in the hearts of people. Then somebody else told me, and I inspected this a little bit, they said almost every day on his sarcophagus, which was down, in the basement of St. Peter's, new fresh flowers appeared. There was no system. They just appeared. Where? People coming in from the Paese property, the outskirts, would bring flowers in. People from the city, people who loved him. I know, I checked on it 2 or 3 times. There was always fresh flowers. There was something about his persona that evidently permeated the consciousness of people. Okay? A very beautiful kind of thing. Okay? Well, he said certain things after a while about the calling of the council. Now, the one thing that he said, I think, was to one of those large groups at one of his public appearances with them. And I'll never forget this, and it stays in my mind. These are the exact words. Okay, he said, the idea for a council did not come as the slowly ripening fruit of long deliberation. It came rather as the sudden flowering of some unexpected spring. It is by God's grace, then, that we shall hold this council. Beautiful quotation. On another occasion, he said to a group, he said, the idea came as a sudden flash of inspiration. Well, he was questioned then course, by scholars and newspaper people and so on. Well, was it like a vision? He said, no, nothing like that. He said it was like an experience that many of you have at prayer. At prayer, sometimes, don't you get a sense of what God is saying? He said, it came to me in prayer. That this is what God was saying to me. It was no vision or something like that, but something very real. And according to him, that was one of the major reasons he called for the council. Now, my source close to the Vatican told me, I don't know if this is true, but it's, again, something that really says how people felt. He said, Padre, he said, you know, when he called the council, and then he was going to have these committees prepare everything and the documents and so on, he said that he would give them like 3.5 years. And Ottaviani's people came and said, we can never do that in that time, 3.5 years. He said, fine, we'll do it in 3. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it expressed something. Not only was he gentle, loving, spiritual, he was determined. And then in his talk, his opening talk at the council, you probably know the Pope does not attend the council, which is good politically in the best sense of the word, because they're the ones doing this and will be presenting it to him. So you should never have that person present for it. But in that talk, which lasted almost an hour, and he expressed the purposes of the council, what was remarkable is, unlike almost every other council, there was no heresy. There was no great upset in the church. There was no one thing we really had to resolve. And isn't that true when you look back on that period? It was pretty ordinary. And so he said, one of the great purposes of the council is for the spiritual good and welfare of all Christians and all people. And then he said also, and in order to investigate how we may be more united in spirit and prayer with the other religions. Now, very general, you know. I'm sure some would say very pious, but very sound. It wasn't, we are going to, like so many councils, fight the Arian heresy or whatever. Nothing dramatic like that, but something much more, you know, in the flow of things. Now, here's another very interesting thing. Vatican II was the first, now use the adjective, the first completed council since the Council of Trent, which ended up in 1563. 399 years in between. Now, there was Vatican I, many of you know that, in 1869-70, but it lasted only about 6 months or so because the Franco-Prussian War suddenly erupted. The French considered themselves kind of the patrons of the Vatican who protected them, and they said, we can no longer do that because all our forces are at this war. And so the council was quickly stopped at that point, but they never finished it. And it began to be rumored that maybe, even in my younger days in the priesthood, that maybe Pius XII would finish it, but he never did. So it was never completed. The first complete council, imagine that, 399 years without a council. I was going to bring a list of all the councils with me, and I simply forgot, just to show you how unusual that was. I mean, some centuries we had 3 councils. One century we had, I guess you count 4. And here is the other thing. So often in our tradition, except from the 9th to the 11th century, people who were at a council were still alive when the next council was held. Now here's a very interesting thing. In the United States, are there any bishops, even in retirement, who are still alive who attended Vatican II? But he was the last one. They are all deceased. One good scholarly friend of mine said, obviously, it's time for another council. And you know what the biggest problem is? How many bishops were at Vatican II? Almost all of them. 2,700. How many bishops do we have today? Because of all the new Christians and so on, new Catholics, smaller countries, more auxiliaries. We have almost 7,000. Where would we put them? They won't fit in St. Peter's. Would it be the same kind of thing? 2,700 people you can sort of organize. Could you organize 7,000? I wonder what that means for the future of councils. So in any event, that's a bit of a background to the council. Now I'll make a few other comments on certain things that I experienced. I remember, because, and Ed remembers this so well too, that at the residence we were at, so often we had somebody come over for the council, it seemed to me sometimes almost every week, and give us a talk on what was going on in the council. What a great experience that was. And I have to tell you this quick thing about it. When I arrived, Ed and Don Krause, they were there from Pittsburgh, the other guys, they received me so graciously and told me everything that was going on and so on. And they said, you know, we get all these people from the council, experts, bishops, cardinals, and so on, said, you really shouldn't miss those. Well, what happened in my life was that I was supposed to have 2 months off during the summer to prepare for this, but I was at Our Lady of Grace still, but I was also the chaplain at St. Clair Hospital, so I had a lot of hospital experience. And one hospital chaplain got very ill, and the bishop said, would you mind kind of substituting for him as best you can? And I did that, and I couldn't get out of it up to 2 days before my boat would leave. I'll never forget that. That was my preparation time to go to Rome. I went back to the parish, had dinner with Monsignor Conroy, got in his car, and he drove me to New York. The next day, I got on the boat. No preparation at all. I hadn't even seen the curriculum. Well, when I arrived, I said, I got to start to study Italian. I got to brush up. All the classes were in Latin. I had to brush up on my Latin. I had to find the curriculum and so on. So whenever they told me about all these guys coming over from the council, I said, well, maybe after I'm here a couple of months or so, I'm going to start to do that. Now, I don't know how this happened. Maybe I could say, like the Pope, a sudden flash of inspiration came to me. Really. And I said, Eugene, whenever I talk to myself, I always call myself Eugene, not Gene. I said, Eugene, this is history. This is not going to happen again. Oh my God, don't say you're not prepared. Even if you don't get your degree, you go to those talks. I never missed one. One of the best decisions I made. All kinds of people come. Cardinal Heenan from England and other experts and so on. And you know, the council is supposed to be confidential, so when they came over, of course, they had to be very careful. Now, a couple of people who were more studied than I and knew more about it, maybe even Ed, they said, yeah, but just notice, almost every one of them breaks that rule. And they'll say, well, now this is not quite confidential, but I'd like to tell you. We learned so much about the council. What an experience that was. And then finally, I'll tell you this. There was a group who I think maybe, especially the guys who had studied in Rome and knew the place pretty well, you were not allowed to go to working sessions of the council. Now, there were certain public sessions. Well, they figured out a way to get into working sessions. It was rather risky, but by my second year there, now I was really attracted to that. So I talked to some of these guys, and I said, can you tell me how you do that? Well, they did. And they said, but it's a bit of a risk, and so on. But I took the risk. I am so glad that I broke the law. And I got in to a working session, 9 o'clock to 1 in the afternoon. Well, what an experience. I was stopped twice, but they told me what to say. I always called those people, you know, the secret police. They were parading all around. And the goal was, by the way, they had built a second tier in St. Peter's, which was up for 4 years, you know. And that's where the experts and the observers sat. You know, the bishops were all on the floor. Once you got up into the second tier, Well, you weren't disturbed. So I finally made my way up second tier. And I'll never forget this. I was so excited. And I was looking around, and I noticed this beautiful shock of white hair in front of me, and I wondered who that was. And I looked around, and it was Bernard Herring, the great moral theologian. I thought, boy, am I in good company here. This is wonderful. Okay. Well, I wanted to find certain people, and it wasn't hard because they were in order of their ordination. So the ones who were the oldest, like Cardinal Ottaviani, I wanted to see what he looked like. Now, it was easy to spot him, honest to God. I looked up at least, I was there 4 hours, 6, 7 times. Every time I looked up, here's how he was seated. Every time I looked up, I thought, does he ever change? Then I looked for, do you remember Bishop Fulton Sheen? Yeah. He was right in the middle. Do you know what he was doing the whole time? This is what he was doing. Listening carefully and taking notes. As far as I can tell, every time I looked down for 4 hours, he was taking notes. I was so impressed. And then I looked down at the younger ones, Bishop Wright. You know what he was doing? He saw me up there, and I could tell from his lips. He was pointing at me, half smiling, and saying, how did you get in here? And I had to explain to him. But it was wonderful to be there for that thing. You were allowed to speak for 10 minutes, not 10 minutes and 4 seconds. They were very strict about that. Somebody told me, now I don't know if this is true, only one person in the whole history of the council spoke for 13 minutes. And it was Cardinal Cushing. And, you know, he didn't know much Latin, he wasn't a scholar, and so on. But he was paying the way for at least 50 of the bishops from the poorer countries. They didn't dare cut him off. That's what I was told. But there were hardly any empty seats. Everybody seemed to be paying attention. Everybody observing the 10-minute rule. And then what would happen every day is the council ended at 1, 3-hour siesta, and at 4 o'clock, the committee who had written the document, the original one, they met to discuss it. Okay? Every day. It was remarkable. What an experience that was. And finally, in giving you this background of the council, what really impressed me was, well, everything impressed me, but this was particular. For the first time in history, women were invited to be observers at the 3rd and 4th session. 13 of them in session 3 and 21 in session 4. Some people said, well, you know, that's just on the surface. I mean, what did that? They weren't allowed to speak. And say, none of the observers could speak, but they were part of the group, you know. They were with the bishops. They were respected people. What an experience. Women at the council, you know. And the final thing I'll mention about my trip to the council, there was always a coffee break, 25 minutes or so, halfway through. Okay, and there were 2 coffee bars, one on either side. And the one on my side, there must have been somebody with a good sense of humor. It was a big sign. For the coffee bar, it was Bar Jonah. And I thought, that's wonderful. And I got down on the steps, and I was looking, do I dare? What if they stop me again? And so on. And I'm looking like this, and I hear a voice say, are you Eugene? And I thought, and I looked, and there was this bishop from Tanzania. And I thought, oh my gosh. Because when I drove Bishop Wright to dinner, sometimes he invited me in to sit with him. And this was this bishop, I forget what his exact name was, Wafula, I think. Okay. And he said, are you Bishop Wright Eugene? And I said, well, yes, I am, Bishop. He said, oh, when I went down, I took his arm. He said, well, come into the coffee bar with me. And I wanted to look like his expert or something. I wouldn't let him go. Well, that was a great experience. How were the people assembled in the coffee bar? Now, I won't exaggerate. Most of the groups were not, you could tell, close friends. Some of them had darker faces. Some of them, you know, had Mexican or Latin American faces. Okay? The women were scattered around in the groups, as were many of the experts and other observers, or Protestant observers, and so on. It was really touching to see that. Okay? And then I have to say this, I don't know who he was, but one of the Eastern bishops was behind me in the coffee line. Okay? And I thought to myself, you know, with your little plastic cup and everything, and he had one. And by the way, that looked so out of place, because he had beautiful brocaded frontispiece, you know, a large headpiece, and he's got this, you know, coffee cup that's whatever plastic or so. I said, this is the only time he's ever going to have to wait for me. So I took my time. You know, we got to equalize things here. It was wonderful. But I'm glad I even had that experience, just to see kind of how it is relating, how it is going. Council was an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary experience. Okay, my final introduction, the document itself. Now, here's a very interesting thing about the document. There were many decrees and so on written officially for the documents. The Sacred Congregation of Rites, maybe a bishop's conference, not just theological articles or so on, okay, official ones. 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. For the document on the liturgy, the author of my book, rather the editor of it, Flannery, he said, there are probably 10 or 15 times more documents issued about the liturgy document than any other document in the council. And so he said, I had to select at least the important ones. I selected 25 documents, and they're printed in my book of the council documents. And here is just a little indication. The document, the council document itself, was about 36 pages. Those documents, in the book that I have, are 254 pages. Why that interest? I'm not going to say it's the most important document on the liturgy, but it's the one that touches everyone immediately. And I think that was why there was so much interest in. You would see a document declaring something about music or something about how to participate and so on. Just remarkable to see that many pages of Congregation of Rites, commissions, bishops are writing about that document. Says something about its importance, its nature. Okay. Now, the document itself. What does the document tell us? And I might have to continue this in the final session, but I really did want to get to most of these things. Okay. Well, the document itself begins in an interesting way. It speaks about the presence of Christ. And the document says, now it's interesting, it says this, I think, to get away from that philosophical notion about the substance of the bread changes into the substance of Christ and the accidents remain the same. You know, in that way of speaking about things, what it says in liturgy, Christ is present in the priest who ministers. Christ is present where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. There am I. Christ is present in the Word. And in the bread and wine, Christ is present par excellence. No philosophical treatment, you know what I mean? That's the incredible presence, the one that is most important, the one that really touches us all. And it goes on to say some very interesting things. It says, that is the goal, ultimately, of all spirituality, to be in union with the divine. That's why the Eucharist is so important. And it even says, now is this an exaggeration? It is really the source of all power in the church. That Christ is really, truly with us. Fascinating, interesting thing. Okay. Well, the document has many fascinating things like that. Now, what I'm going to do, just in case you want to check this in the document is numbered by like paragraphs and so on. There are 5 chapters, but if you really want to look at something, I'll give you the paragraph numbers as I tell you about the things, okay? It says, and this is number 14, paragraph number 14. It says, the liturgy should have full, active, complete participation by all of the people, and this should be restored in all of our changes in liturgy. Full, active participation of everyone. Now, I guess that's an ordinary thing to us. Back in 1962, 63, that was quite a thought. I mean, remember, we couldn't participate that much in Latin. Okay. It says also in that same chapter, the revision of prayer and the texts should be done so that Christian people should be able to understand everything with ease and take part in them fully, actively, as a community. They're constantly emphasizing that. Now that sets a certain tone that I think is dramatic, okay? Now, as setting something for the future, then in number 20, paragraph 22, it says, the regulation of the liturgy after the Apostolic See belongs primarily to the bishops' conferences. Well, that's a remarkable thing, because whenever you start interpreting the documents, and this happens, and the bishops could put out those decrees. Now, they had to be approved by the Apostolic See. But they're the ones who could adapt the liturgy to their own cultures. And the bishops are going to see, or the conference is going to say that specifically. Now, other things it says, and some of these are just charming. It says, the rites should be short and clear and free from useless repetition and within the people's power of comprehension, and should normally not require explanation. You see the direction that we're moving in. And that's what we should be experiencing today. Okay. Now, this may surprise you. This is number 36. The use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. Does that strike you? Well, here's what it says immediately following that. It says, but since the use of the vernacular, whether in the Mass or the sacraments or other parts of the liturgy, may frequently be of greater advantage to the people, a wider use may be used for the vernacular. In readings, directives, some prayers, and regulations governing this will be given separately in subsequent chapters, and that's where it tells how the bishops' conferences can do that. Now, why would they do that? Say it's retained, but bishops' conferences do that. Here's what the explanation that I heard, from people I think who knew a lot, that there were some very conservative bishops and cardinals. They couldn't just say, use the vernacular all the time. Okay. So they had to say it very carefully. The Latin will be retained. And of course, the Latin is retained in one way. We still have a typical edition of the Mass in Latin that everybody must translate. Now that's about all. Well, because of this, an interesting essay that I read on this. Okay, the council ends in 1965. The council says, you know, you can adapt this in the vernacular and use the vernacular in many places and so on. Now, I don't know if any of you will remember that the first times the changes came to us, we could use them. There was still a part in Latin and part in English. Okay. By 1971, everything was in English in all the English-speaking countries. By 1971. Because they kept adapting. Okay? And today, it's just second nature. Now, one of the reasons I point that out, not only is it interesting, is that's the kind of evolution that came from Vatican II. And the kind that could continue in certain ways. Does it really move the people? Is it clear? Does it explain it to them with little explanation? All those phrases. They're very, very important, and the council document says them very clearly. Okay, so now another very interesting thing. It says the rites are to be simplified, and parts which suffered loss through the accidents of history are to be restored. What do you think they were referring to? Here's what scholars say they were referring to. Communion in the hand. It's an accident of history. We said, and I already said this, we were talking about how evil people are, sinful. Therefore, they shouldn't touch it. I always thought, does that mean the priest isn't sinful? He's touching it all the time. Communion under both species. Remember the 12th century? We said there's too many people. Can you imagine saying that today? You can't give the wine because there's too many people. Too many communions. Or, I suppose, this very simple one, the priest turning around and facing the people. Now, one of the great reasons the priest was turned around, well, there are several. I'll just say them very quickly. I may have mentioned this before. But one was a tradition that since Christ is the new light, you know, risen Christ, rising in the east, many churches were built facing the east so that everybody would be facing the east, you know. And so the priest should be too. He shouldn't have his back to it. Second reason was, after a while, Latin was not understood by the people. And so the priest was the only one who understood. And so everybody looked up to the priest leading this sacred drama rather than this community meal. And that became kind of the regular thing. And now the document is really saying, okay, that's one of the aberrations of the past. And those things should be restored. Okay? So, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Well, finally I'll say that there's an interesting comment. Well, there's so many other interesting comments, but you might be interested in this one. It said there will be no change in that section on the feasts. There'll be no change in Easter. Well, now why would they mention that specifically? Now, this one isn't quite so clear, but at least some of the scholars say it is. I don't know if you're aware of this. In the original evolution of church celebration, we did not have Holy Week. Thursday, you know, the day of the final supper. Friday, the day of the Passion and Death. Saturday, the day of expectation, and Sunday, the resurrection. You know what we had for over 300 years? We had one feast, the Paschal Feast, death to life. Now, some scripture scholar, Demetrius Dumm, a great Benedictine who wrote 5 wonderful books, he said, remember, talking about this transition, passion and death never have full meaning unless you're talking also about resurrection. You can't talk about it itself. And he said, resurrection, it would be a wonderful thing to look at. But without the passion and death, that's what began salvation. They belong together. How did they get separated? Whenever the persecutions went over and people went to the Holy Land and found the places where many of these things happened, they brought that information back to their own countries and said, well, the supper was probably here, even though some of those are very inaccurate. And so gradually that became a separate celebration. And then the Passion and Death did, and then the resurrection, outside of Jerusalem and so on. And so it developed into 3 celebrations. Interesting thing to think about. And here's Demetrius Dumm's comment, simple comment. You do not understand the Passion and Death fully unless you are very aware of the role of the resurrection giving it full meaning. Okay? You do not understand the resurrection fully unless you understand how the passion and death led to it and gave us life instead of death. Very interesting observation. Okay? So what I would say to you now in terms of what I've given you about the Second Vatican Council document, that it has moved us in the direction of full participation, liturgy that is immediately understandable, so it can touch us, move us. Okay? Liturgy that is fitting to different cultures and different groups of people, okay? Men and women. Okay? I would say, even beyond the specific changes it talks about, that it is very important to sense the tone that it creates. And it gives us the feeling, of what might be possible in the future. And that's what I'm trying to create in you. I'll never forget when Hans Kung, that very liberal theologian, some people criticize him greatly, said, what was the greatest change in the Second Vatican Council? And Kung said, the greatest change in the Second Vatican Council was the notion of change. But he meant it seriously. We, for probably 400 years, said, well, we don't change. From the time of Trent until 1962. And now the Council said, we are always evolving, not changing our doctrine or dogma at all, okay? But we can see how evolution helps our spirituality, moves us closer to the person of Christ. So I think there are wonderful things like that in the council documents that are very helpful to observe and understand and feel with. Okay? So I recommend all of those to you, and just see, do they touch you? Do they touch you pastorally? Do they start to move you in a little bit different ways in terms of our roles in the evolution of the Mass?